Let's get to the convention because that's really one of the keys to this whole book. And you write about the difficulty. Here is the convention that is seen by some artists, and you say it's very difficult to assess him in the convention because, one, maybe the secrecy rule, people didn't talk about what was going on, the lack of notes that were really taken on that, even though Madison and others were taking notes that were indispensable to us today as historians. But there wasn't a lot that was written out what Washington himself did. Maybe if we had Twitter, we would have known more.
Yeah. Well, we know indirectly, but I think you're absolutely right. What has made... Well, first there's this... I think there's two tendencies. But first there's this tendency to make Washington seem like a wax figure. That he sits up there like something in Madame Trudeau's wax museum. And we don't, as much as we do with Lincoln or Jefferson or other presidents, he doesn't seem to us as human because he became this icon. It's this icon, and we see pictures of him wearing a toga, statues of him in a toga and things like this. So that makes him seem flat. When, as we know, as a human being, he was far from that. He was a tremendous conversationalist one-on-one. He talked with all. He went to a party. He would dance with every lady, and he would talk with every man. And people who would listen to him, he was a tremendous. What do they say that? A tremendous retail politician. Mm-hmm. He talked with people well. It's somewhat like Ronald Reagan was famous for. That when he actually had Tip O'Neill near him, he could just mesmerize him. And Washington was a great storyteller. He had, of course, all the great stories from the Revolutionary War and from back in Virginia to tell, and from the War of 1812 and the Fort Necessity. He had great stories to tell, and he told them well. And so people loved talking to him. He was a good conversationalist. That's not the part of Washington we know. We see this image of Washington on the $1 bill, and he looks just foreboding and like your great-grandfather sitting up there. But also, as you mentioned, there was a secrecy rule, so we didn't have somebody reporting on the convention other than Madison and a couple people in the room who took notes of what was said substantively. Now, Washington was elected as the chair, as the president of the convention, and therefore he couldn't participate in the moment by moment debates. He couldn't speak substantively in the room, so he's never quoted in Madison's notes. So he disappears out of that. But we can step back a step, and that's what I did with this book. He was writing letters to other people. He was voting. Even though he became president of the convention, he still voted with the Virginia delegation because the states voted as a unit. Virginia had one vote, New York, Delaware had one vote, as long as they were represented. And the typical rule was they had to have half of their delegates there to be represented, so states would go in and out of representation. So sometimes you only had 9 states or 11 states participating. Sometimes you had up to 12. Now, Washington always voted within his delegation. There were up to a dozen votes a day. And after George Wythe left the convention because his wife was dying, Washington became typically the decisive vote in his own delegation. For example, Virginia would not have voted for the Constitution itself. They would have voted no. They would have been tied. They would have deadlocked 2-2 without Washington. This was 3-2. We know that because by this time Randolph and Mason were voting no. And then for a Bill of Rights, Virginia votes no. Washington has decided many key issues on presidential power because Mason and Randolph wanted a 3-member executive like the old triumvirates in Republican Rome. They didn't want a single executive, a unitary executive. So Washington was, as I said there, tax policy. Washington was very strong for a national power to tax. Several other members of his delegation had flipped off of this much power for the national government on taxing. So we see Washington's vote being decisive. So we know he's involved voting. Everybody in the convention, they all looked up to him. He was the largest man in America. Well, Ben Franklin was too. But Ben Franklin was pretty old at this time, and people greatly admired him. But Washington was the symbol of national unity ever since he'd written the circular letter to the states. So people were looking to him. He was voting, and he was also meeting. He lived in Robert Morris's house, and most of the others lived in boarding houses. But he didn't eat. He ate in the Morrises. He went out and ate in the taverns with the other delegates. So he was talking to them. He was going to teas every night. He was going to parties with the other delegates. He was talking with the other delegates. There are letters from them talking about him. Mm-hmm. There also, he is writing letters at this time to Jefferson, to others back in Virginia. And in his letters are paralleling what is happening at the convention at that time. So he's deeply involved with shaping, he has to be deeply involved with shaping what's happening at the convention. Because if you look at the final, what's funny about the final, they often say that a typical textbook would say James Madison is the architect of the Constitution. And in some ways he was. But if James Madison was the architect, then George Washington was the general contractor, getting it done, getting the pieces together. Because the convention came close to breaking down on several occasions, such as over whether each state gets a senator, or over the issue of the Three-Fifths Compromise with slavery. And in each of those occasions, you can see with the meetings he had at night and the people who ended up speaking and breaking the compromise, they were always very close allies of Washington, that Washington played a key role in keeping the convention going. And when you look at the final product, what is actually striking when you read Madison's notes or put together the pieces, Madison gets rolled on so many things he cared so deeply about. He believed that the national government should have a veto over states' rights, for example. Loses. Believed strongly in lower federal courts. It doesn't get included in the Constitution except as an option. Certain areas dealing with this, he wanted the national government to appoint the state governors, much like the king used to appoint the colonial governors. Loses on that. Item after item on the details, Madison loses on. But if you compared when Washington went to the convention, he had drafted out, he had written before the convention to John Jay, who was the foreign secretary for the Confederation Congress, Henry Knox, who was the war secretary, and James Madison, asking what they thought, each of them separately, what they should be in the Constitution. Then he takes what they all say and digests it in his own handwriting into the things he wanted. We know of his comments earlier, in his speeches earlier, in his circular letter to the states. The Constitution includes everything that Washington wanted. It lacks a lot of the things that Madison wanted. So that's why I say in the end, even though Washington, he wasn't technically brilliant. He wasn't a political philosopher. He looked very much, and he relied heavily on Gouverneur Morris, on James Madison, of course, on Robert Wilson, people he had enormous respect, James Wilson, that he had enormous respect for. He relied for them for a lot of details. But when you're talking about a big picture, he had the big picture. And he wove these ideas into a big picture. And that's an activist role for Washington that does not typically appear in the accounts. Activist in this period.
Well, there's so much that goes on in those early first years, too, especially with the convention, first moments. And I'm showing a print about the Newburgh conspiracy. Mm-hmm. Now, Washington wished to be neutral when he came into he was hesitant to get into the convention at all. Mm-hmm. And I think we're lucky that he got there, because he seemed, as you're saying, to hold the whole framework together. It would have failed. But he wanted to be neutral, but he was pushed into a more nationalistic framework, because he really was on the fence between the states' rights and the national government. But as you're saying, he was pushed toward the nationalistic view. How did that happen, and how did his reputation for the moment, to some extent, suffer in those days? from this Newburgh event.
Well, the Newburgh conspiracy was at the tail end of the Revolution, after the successful Battle of Yorktown, when it looked like the British will probably give up. But they didn't have to. Britain had a lot of resources. They could have come back again and tried again. They still held New York City and Charleston, South Carolina. And so the troops were concentrated up in Newburgh, just north in the Hudson Valley, just north of New York. What was left of the American army was up there, waiting to see if the Britain was going to give up the colonies after the defeat at Yorktown, and which took almost a couple of years, months and months went on. And so what happened is the troops, Congress had stopped paying the troops. They had run out of money. They couldn't get any more loans. The states were not paying, most of the states were not paying their requisitions. The Confederation had no power to raise tax money. They couldn't tax people. They couldn't even force states to pay. They sort of had to go hat in hand to the states. And the states, after the crisis, after it was clear that the British were on the run after Yorktown, and even before to an extent, states stopped sending in their money. And so the national government, the central government as it would be called, the Confederation Congress, would ask for money, and Franklin was pretty good at getting it from France, and they got some from foreign countries, but if they couldn't pay it back, and so they stopped paying the troops, and the troops virtually went into mutiny at Newburgh. The idea was, already people had talked to, this isn't working, Washington, you need to take power. You need to march down and become the leader. And when you think back, that was what the British had threatened all during the war. All during the war, Britain had sent notices out to America, put in newspapers, says, why are you revolting? You know what happened with Cromwell. You know what happened to Caesar. You're just changing one King George III, for another in George Washington. Washington knew that. And Washington always denied it, said, I want to go back to Mount Vernon. I don't want to have political power. Newburgh's where it came to a head, where they were trying, it seems, to either make Washington take over, and so the national government could get money and pay the troops, or get Horatio Gates, the hero at Saratoga, to take over, or simply refuse to disband, have the army, no matter what happens, because they thought peace was coming, refuse to disband, stay under the leaders of the junior officers. Some of these junior officers were alleged to have connections with Horatio Gates, until they were paid. Basically, that would be a mutiny. Stay in power until they were paid. And Washington, they called a meeting without Washington's approval of the officers. He stepped forward, and it looked like they had the backings of the nationalists in the Congress, being Hamilton, Robert Morris, who was the head of the finance department then, and Gouverneur Morris, his top assistant, and perhaps others were in on this conspiracy. It's always been the debatable factors. The best scholarship suggests that they were indeed involved, and and Washington is appalled with this idea. And Washington plays his hand beautifully, masterfully. He gives them enough rope to hang themselves, as it were. And then he turns around and, with a famous address and a speech, he breaks the conspiracy and sends them packing. Yeah. And this gets tremendous press in the United States. This is where people say, first in war, first in peace. Mm-hmm. That he is not going to be this military dictatorship, not going to follow the route of Cromwell. And that, if he was a hero before for Yorktown, and certainly he had had enough defeats, enough failures, such as the Battle of Long Island, that there was a mixed view of Washington, but with Yorktown at the end, and with the Patriot press knowing they needed a hero, always pumping up Washington as that hero, he had a strong image. But when Newburgh was reported, he becomes the icon that we know, because he had stood against this military revolt that the British had always said was coming, and he then voluntarily surrendered when the British leave New York. The first thing he does is he races down, and I cover that in the book, and that is the opposite of the return of George Washington. That's the departure of George Washington. He races down to Congress, which is then meeting in Annapolis, because they have been driven from Philadelphia by mutinous troops. So they were now meeting in Annapolis. He goes down there. Heroes welcome the whole way down. Heroes welcome into New York, of course. He returns over his commission, and that famous scene of him handing his commission to the president of the Confederation Congress, Thomas Mifflin, that's the one that a later Congress chose to memorialize with that great mural.
Sure.
That's by Benjamin West, that's in the Capitol Rotunda, turning over power, establishing the myth, but also the reality. It's the story of Cincinnatius. Why it's the Cincinnati Society, Cincinnati, Ohio, named after it. This legend of turning over power and returning to his farm to be a farmer. That's the departure. But what we're then following is, what did he really do? He does really remain quite involved. He doesn't seek the presidency, but he remains absolutely committed. This has convinced him, we need a stronger central government, or otherwise we'll fall apart.